guys, I'm Kristen. Welcome back to my channel. I'm in my comfy chair. I've got a full to the brim cup of tea, a little bit of a cold, but need to film anyway. And today we're going to be discussing whether or not you should read A Course of Dragons series by Jenn Lyons. So A Course of Dragons series is currently 4 books, beginning with A Ruin of Kings, with the 5th and final book scheduled to come out in April of 2022, which means if you are thinking about possibly picking this series up, you still have a fair bit of time to get a decent way or all the way through the currently released books before the final book comes out next year. Now, I like to do these should you read videos when the book in question is a little bit different. And I think one in which, or a series in which, absolutely not everyone is going to like or vibe with this story and the way that it is being told. I will start off by talking a little bit about the premise, but I think the majority of the time in this video is actually going to be talking a lot about the structure and the style in which this story is being told, because it is extremely distinct and is probably going to be one of the things that turns a lot of people off of this series. On the surface, this comes across as your basic epic fantasy series. We have a young 15, 16-year-old boy at the beginning named Kieran who has unknown parentage and in the first book discovers who his family might be, but he also discovers around this time that there is a prophecy involving him and the destruction of the world. And in fact, he finds out that he might be responsible for the destruction of the world at some point in the future. It has a large, expansive, epic fantasy world in which there are dragons, demons, otherworld, past lives, reincarnation, soul switchings, witches, wizards, a kraken, and everything that you can possibly imagine existing in a fantasy book is probably in this book, but Jenn Lyons puts it all together in such a unique way. It does not feel done before at all. On top of this, Jenn Lyons has created a world and a story in which there are people of all shapes and colors and proclivities. We have a large queer cast of characters, including a character that the author herself has described as the ultimate disaster bisexual. The way that Jenn Lyons has chosen to structure and tell this story is where this becomes really unique and also something that might really turn you off. The books are being presented in the way that they are actually a compilation, like an existing book within that world, within the world of the story itself, and that somebody has compiled or written this book themselves. We'll refer to that person as the narrator. There are, in fact, 2 narrators in the series. The narrator has also chosen to provide footnotes throughout the book, and I will say that even though sometimes they are annoying, they are absolutely worth reading and flipping back and forth to read, because they include filler information on world building. Sometimes they are just humorous input by the narrator themselves. Sometimes they contradict what is being told in the story in the moment, and sometimes they provide really important background information or information that the person whose perspective we're getting in the story in that moment does not know. So while we know that this is the initial setup, that the book that we're reading is actually a report or a compilation that has been created by one of the characters that is in the story themselves, one of our narrators, there is further breakdown within the book itself. There is a structure or a framework story, and then there is a story within the story. Each of the 4 books does this a little bit differently. In the first book, A Ruin of King, Kieran is in jail and he's being jailed and held captive by a character named Talon. The story within the story in A Ruin of Kings is when Kieran begins to tell his story. However, there's almost 2 stories within a story in the first book, and that is because Kieran decides to start his story from one point in time in which he is a slave, and he begins to tell his story working up to the point where he is now in jail. Talon decides that he didn't go far back enough in his history to tell the story, and so Talon begins his story from a younger age, a further point back in history, and begins to tell the story up until the point that Kieran did when he becomes a slave. And there's usually about 20% of the book at the end that is moving forward in time from our framework setting. In the second book, The Name of All Things, the framework structure is Kieran, again, sitting in a bar with a different character, this time who I won't name. But then in this one, we have two characters who go back in time and tell Kieran their story, and that is the story within the story, and it takes place over roughly the same time period as the first book did. The third book, The Memory of Souls, it is once again Kieran and another character who are sitting down and talking about the events of what just happened. So they are in the future from where we start off, and they are kind of reeling from everything that has just happened and talking about what all went down. And in this one, we have Kieran is always telling his own story. And in this case, the person that he's sitting with has in fact gotten notes from other people. And so that part of the story is told from several different perspectives. So again, the framework is Kieran and that character sitting in the future. And the story within the story is the events that happened from the end of the second book up until that moment in time where they're sitting together. And then finally, in the fourth book, The House of Always, this one is a little bit weirder. It's not two people sitting and having a conversation. There is a lighthouse where time moves extremely slowly, and a wide cast of characters are now suddenly finding themselves in this lighthouse where events are shaking out. And then once again, we are getting that's the framework, and then we get a story within the story. And this one is told as actually snippets of all of their memories that they're being forcibly shown to all of them that go back in time at different amounts of time. But anyway, the story within the story is all of their memories of the events leading up to the point of where they are in that framework story. So that is why the structure and the framework are so unique and different, because we're always having this weird sense of time, this fractured story with flashbacks or with events being told after they've already happened. And on top of that, we still have the footnotes that are tucked in. As I said, we do have two narrators. It's not overly complicated. We don't have two narrators per book. They actually take turns. So there's narrator number one narrates the first book and the third book, and narrator number two narrates the second book and the fourth book. One additional thing to note here that you might find really, really cool, or perhaps not your thing, is that by the time we get to the third book, The Memory of Souls, the books themselves start being referenced, because again, these are books that have been compiled by our narrators who are characters in the book itself. And at some point, some of our characters have had a chance to read them, and so they will occasionally comment on the past books as actual books. And the narrators will sometimes even take jabs at each other for presenting information wrong or in a biased way, or fill in information that the other narrator didn't have. And so that's why not only are these footnotes so exceptional for that they fill in the breadth of information that you have, but they also lead to this sense of that the way that we hear stories, the way that we perceive how things are not always exactly as they are, or they are done so in a biased way. And we get this impression that maybe things are not exactly as they are. And that might really bother you, or you might think it's a really, really cool way of telling a story. Another thing that you will either really like or really hate is the complexity of the story and the world itself. Not only is the structure really complicated, but the world and the characters and what is happening within the world and the magic is also extremely complicated. In regards to world building, this is one of those types of books that kind of just throws you into the deep end and lets you figure things out on your own. We don't have all of the information. Kieran, our main character, we're hearing the story from, or any of the characters that we're getting information from at any given point, it's been made very clear to us they don't have all of the information. And you have to be okay with not knowing and understanding everything about this world. And then what I would say is one of the most complicated aspects has to do with who all of the characters are and how they are all related to each other. In this world, there are past lives and reincarnation. There are also a couple different species of beings who are extremely long-lived, if not quite immortal. And then on top of that, there is soul switching. There is an item, a powerful item or object within this world that when a person wearing it is killed, it protects that person from dying, but not their physical body. It instead saves their soul and places it in the body of their killer. The killer is now dead, their soul goes to the afterlife. And this significantly plays into the world history, which is extremely important to the story and the prophecy and everything that is happening and who everyone is. I think the complexity or the confusingness of the story is perhaps the most critiqued aspect of this book itself. Throughout each of the 4 books, you do not have all of the information you need to piece everything together. And that is an intentional decision being made by the author. I would say that the who people are and how they relate to each other confusingness is maybe the one part of the story that I think does not necessarily have to be as confusing as it is. But at the same time, it is also an element that leads to some of the more humorous moments in this book. Okay, now that we've got the structure and the complexity of the story out of the way, I'd love to talk a little bit about the tone and the vibe and some of the elements in this book. Despite the fact that we are dealing with a world-ending destruction of everything, kind of a prophecy, the book has quite a humorous note throughout, while also having really, really sad and dark, depressing moments as well. When we meet up with Kieran, he is quite a young boy originally, and he comes across as quite young in both his humor and the style in which the chapters from his perspective are being written. They're a lot more informal, they're very relaxed, they're very jokey. There are some absolutely chaotic and hilarious moments throughout this book, not just from Kieran, who has the more light-hearted young person humor, but there are ridiculously hilarious moments, particularly pertaining to the complicatedness of who everyone is, whether or not they've known each other in the past, or the ways in which they've interacted with each other in the past, and the complicated elements involved there. On the flip side, we deal with really significant and traumatic experiences within Kieran's and other characters' lives. There is a full trigger list or trigger warning list on Jenn Lyons' website for each of the 4 books currently out, so you can check that out. I will link each of those pages down below so you can read a little bit further. And I would say the more heavy mental health aspects of the book reach that climax in the 4th book, The House of Always, which really, really focuses on how their experiences up to that point in the book have affected each of the characters involved in this story. There is a lot of queer exploration within this book, particularly I would say in book number 2, The Name of All Things, where we spend a significant amount of time in a culture and a country where they have a different way of identifying gender. It is not the gender that you are born with. You choose your own gender and how you want to identify as in the world. And it's not even male or female. They sort of have like the male and female bodied people. But outside of that, because it is a horse-based culture, and sort of like they had a horse-based god, they like revere horses, they relate to horses a lot, so they actually refer to themselves as either a stallion, a mare, or a gelding. So it's a really cool culture, and there's a lot of queer and gender identity exploration, not only in that book, but throughout the course of all 4 books. Finally, the one final theme that I think might be a little bit spoilery, so if you really, really don't want to know like where this book is going at all, this is something that comes up in maybe the 2nd book, but if you don't want to know even that like theme, then I will put something up here, and when it disappears, you can unmute. Okay, so one of the themes then I would say that is becoming quite apparent as of the 2nd book onwards is that the distinction between the right side or the good side, the evil side, good versus bad, etc., is really unclear. It is a very blurry, non-straight, distinct linear line, and that is more a matter of how everyone is choosing to go about one single problem. We really, really get into that exploration, especially as it pertains to the gods in this world and this prophecy. One final thing that I will say here is that Jenn Lyons' writing style is very relaxed. It is a lot less formal than some of our classic fantasy writing is. It's not particularly flowery or beautiful. It is descriptive, but it's generally fairly straightforward. But where I think her writing really, really shines is that A, it's a little bit bananas and wild and funny, but it changes depending on whose perspective we are in. Each of the characters has a distinct personality, and when we are in that person's perspective, the writing is different. This is especially seen in the footnotes because the two narrators have very different personalities, and the writing of the footnotes is so them in each of the different stories. They have such a unique tone and humor in which they say everything, and it adds so much to the story, because you'll be in, for example, Kieran's head, and Kieran is like young and wild or whatever, and then you have narrator number one who's like a little bit more tight-laced and a little bit more sarcastic, and he'll cut in with like this funny, dry little statement pertaining to something Kieran has said, and it's just so wild and really, really great. If you are thinking about reading this book, how should you read it? I would say don't only listen to the audio. It is complicated, and names that are mentioned one time as like a historical note will come back later on, and it is harder, I think, for people to remember or recognize names when they're just like said once on an audio version and then not again for another 2 books. That being said, the audio books are so good. I think if you are this type of reader and if you have the opportunity to sometimes read this way, I would honestly recommend the best way to consume this series is to read the book physically, either a physical copy or an ebook, and to listen to the audiobook. This has a couple different benefits. One is that the audiobook is narrated by a few different voices, and so you do have a distinct voice for our main character, Kieran, and for both of the 2 narrators. I think it's just 3, but I could be mistaken. Additionally, another benefit that this has is that when you are reading the book and listening to the audio has inserted the footnotes into the middle of like where they belong, where the asterisk is. So instead of having to flip back whenever you get to the asterisk and read the footnote, you'll be reading along and listening, and then suddenly narrator number 1 or number 2's voice will chip in and be like, oh, blah, 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 and it's amazing. And it makes it just like a smoother way of reading it. I think that this book would lend itself quite well to note-taking. I personally am not like a note-taker with books, but that's just a laziness thing. But if you are someone who thinks that you would benefit from that, or if that's something that you already do, this series would really, really lend itself well to that. There is a family tree in the back of the first book, but I would recommend not looking at it until at least the 2/3 mark, because it is a teensy bit spoilery. However, it is really, really helpful from there on out and throughout the rest of the series, even though it's only in the back of that first book. Okay, I hope that has given you a better sense of whether or not you should or shouldn't read this series, if it's something that you think that you'll like versus something you think you will absolutely not enjoy. I think this book, or this series in particular, is going to be people who really like wild and fun roller coaster stories where you do not need to understand everything that is happening. If you are okay just strapping in and going along for the ride and guessing but not knowing and having whiplash in your thoughts of what is happening, and you're okay with that, then this story is a really fun, wild ride, and I hope that you will love it. If all of that sounds horrible, if multiple timelines, if flashbacks, multiple characters who are possibly several different characters because of soul switching and past lives and reincarnations and the whole God thing, like if that just sounds overly complicated and not something that you want to parse through, this book is not going to be for you. Again, this is not going to be for you if you like world building that really sets you up, walks you into it, introduces things in a nice, smooth manner with a clear understanding of the world, the culture, and the magic. This is not that book either, so I would not recommend it for you if that is something that you particularly enjoy and look for in your books. Okay, that is it. Have you read this series? Have you read the first book and put it down, or weren't sure whether or not to continue on? Let me know down below. Let me know if you have any more questions about this series. I have no problem answering more specific questions if you'd like about whether or not you should or shouldn't read this book. Alright, well that is it for me today, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or if you just want to let me know that you're still here at the end, put a little dragon emoji. Most fun dragons. Even though they're a small amount of the plot. I haven't even talked about the dragons. They're so fun. Oh my gosh. These videos will never end. See you next time, guys. Have a great day. Bye.